I've been a climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps, 'cause you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now. For I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. You know what? When I think about this poem, I too think about my own mother, the journey she's had, the steps she had to climb into the light beyond being in the world of belonging to and being a sharecropper's daughter. I also think of my father. His life was certainly no crystal stair. Now, some of you have heard me share my father's story on this podcast, and maybe even in other settings. My father was the first person in his family to go to college, the first person in his family who dared to dream about such a thing as that. In fact, when he was just a little boy, 4 or 5 years old, he talked about 2 of his dreams. He wanted to live in a house with running water and to go to college. Now, in the 1930s, in the deep south of the United States, in rural Mississippi, these were big, bad, audacious dreams, especially for a little black boy. Talking about dreams like these could actually get you killed. But that didn't faze my father. He talked to anybody who would listen. Yes, he did. It didn't matter what you looked like, how old you were, what walk of life you came from. My father passionately talked about his dreams. As a young man, he worked as a janitor at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. Now, this was in the 1950s. So he could work there, but he couldn't attend college there. Why? Because Ole Miss was still segregated. This was before the Civil Rights Movement, which would be about a decade later. So my father is still talking about his dreams to anybody who would listen, the students, the professors, the staff, anybody who would listen, right? Well, one day, all of that would change. One of the administrators at Ole Miss heard about my dad and heard about his dream of going to college. That gentleman met my father and asked him about his dreams. He fell in love with my father. That gentleman was responsible for introducing my dad to the person who would change his life, who would change my family's life for all time. And that person was Pulitzer Prize-winning American author and Nobel laureate William Faulkner. Now, when Faulkner met my father, he was deeply touched by my dad's faith, passion, drive, determination, humility, gratitude, and leadership. Faulkner didn't see my father the way that many whites saw my dad. Now, in those days, my father was viewed as a black man who was way too big for his britches, so to speak. But Faulkner didn't see him that way. Instead, he saw my father the way that God saw him. He saw my father as a man with birthright dignity. He saw my father's humanity and divinity. He saw my father as a man filled with love, light, possibility, and generosity. And that's exactly how my father viewed himself. And that's how my father also viewed Faulkner, as another human being, another man, filled with love, light, possibility, and generosity of spirit. Now, Faulkner offered to pay for my father to attend college, to pay for his tuition, his room and board, his books, with no strings attached. Wow. Pretty amazing, right? Well, what would you do? I mean, what would you do? What would you say if somebody offered you something like that? I mean, this was my dad's lifelong dream. What do you think he said? Well, he said, no. No, sir. I want to go to college more than anything, but I can't accept your generous offer. You see, I don't know how I could ever pay you back. And Faulkner looked at my dad with a twinkle in his eye, and he said, I don't expect you to pay me back. You just pass this blessing on when you're able to do so. Mercy. I mean, who knew? How many of you know that God looks out for his own? That fall, my father enrolled at Alcorn A&M College with my mom, me, and my two older sisters right by his side. So, my father's and my family's story. Not long ago, this story came through in words and images, and this amazing story that I just shared is now available as a children's picture book, as a visual biography that is a great book for people of all ages. Now, before the picture book, before the visual biography, before the words and images of a storybook came through, God gave me the same story, the same arc, but he gave it to me in words and images and light and in the form of a poem. And I want to share that poem with you now. So I shared the story with you, so hopefully it will bring more light into the poem for you. The poem is called Sanctuary. Sanctuary. For my father, Ernest McEwen Jr., and William Faulkner. Between the brush of angels' wings and furious hooves of hell, two mortal men fell down. How you must have looked. White shirt stained, khakis fatigued, smelling of sweat and smoke, hair at odds with itself and the world. At the threshold, among your restless dead, in echo and shadow of ancient oaks, providing sanctuary, offering shade. You had many worlds behind you, few yet to be born. Stories of insurgence, scorn, decay, theme and variations of a vanquished South. Leaning against a jam of antebellum brass, you watched, waited, raised weary arm and hand, saluted the familiar stranger. Come, come, enter, sit, sing. You reached each other across the grate. What you two must have known of heaven and hell. I can picture the home where Faulkner lived, and it's like a light as you walk up this long red brick pathway. The house is painted still white, and so in the pathway up to the house, you see this bright light of white in the paint, in the house, in the presences that guard the home, these ancient trees, these old trees lining the walkway. So the poem talks about the old, ancient qualities in the house, leaning against a jamb, a door jamb, leaning against a jamb of antebellum brass. You watched, waited, raised weary arm and hand, saluted the familiar stranger. Come, enter, sit, sing. You reached each other across the grate. What you two must have known of heaven and hell. So I'm going to read this poem again in its entirety, and this time I just want to invite you to listen keenly for the different qualities of light that appear in the poem. You know, we start out with the brush of angel's wings, which is a certain quality of light, right? And then the furious hooves of hell, which brings on another entirely different kind of quality of light, right? So listen, please, as you hear me again, as you hear this poem on my breath. Listen for the different qualities of light and how they play into and off of one another. Sanctuary. For my father, Ernest McEwen Jr., and William Faulkner. Between the brush of angels' wings and furious hooves of hell, two mortal men fell down. How you must have looked. White shirt stained, khakis fatigued, smelling of sweat and smoke, hair at odds with itself and the world. At the threshold, among your restless dead, in echo and shadow of ancient oaks, providing sanctuary, offering shade. You had many worlds behind you, few yet to be born. Stories of insurgence, scorn, decay, theme and variations of a vanquished South. Leaning against a jamb of antebellum brass, you watched, waited, raised weary arm and hand, saluted the familiar stranger. Come, enter, sit, sing. You reached each other across the grate. What you two must have known of heaven and hell. Deciding on who you will invite to enter, sit, and sing. Deciding on who you include or